Checking the volume. Good. Okay, so here we are, getting ready to record. I just sent out an email with a link to today's video, and in that time frame, a couple minutes, the internet went down, and I had to start a new stream. Here I am on the second stream, and let me go ahead and mute the desktop audio. Yes, and I had to start a new desktop stream. And so that's been happening a lot lately. I hear it's been happening to a lot of other people as well, with everybody home because of the virus. It's putting a lot of pressure on our internet infrastructure. And so if it goes down again, I'll just have to go back to recording these the old fashioned way. So let's go ahead and jump over to the live screen. All right, so here you can see our normal YouTube window. And here's the thing. We had a baby last week and during spring break, and it looks like going forward it's going to be incredibly difficult to stick to set times, like Tuesday, Thursday, 10 a.m., for instance. I'm going to have to record when I can, and so you may not be able to tune in live. Um, I think that's going to be okay. I know a lot of people would feel more comfortable tuning in live, but honestly, it's been probably months since I had a question during lecture. So if you want to um, email me your questions, I'll be happy to answer them. That's fine. But I want to point out this page here because of the subscribe button. If you click the subscribe button, and I am able to do these online, that is in real time. You'll be notified when a stream starts, and you'll be able to tune in and participate if you want to that way. Again, you don't have to. You do need to watch these videos at some point, but it doesn't have to be live. Okay. All right. So let's go back over to the digestive system. Oh, actually, let me close that or else I'll hear the audio the entire time. All right, and let me turn desktop audio back on. So we left off here at the mouth the Thursday before spring break, and we'll try and get through the whole digestive system today. So we mentioned the alimentary canal is a tube that extends from the mouth to the anus. Okay, and so we begin our trip through the digestive system with the mouth. It's the first part of the alimentary canal. This is where we ingest food, and ingest means to bring the food in, as opposed to digest, which means to break it down. Ingest means to bring it in. And mastication is the process of chewing or mechanically breaking down solid foods and mixing them with saliva. Um, oof, oh, all right. So the mouth, of course, we know functions as an organ of speech, surrounded by the lips or labia, the cheeks, the tongue, and then the palate is the roof of your mouth. Now, the mouth here is going to include both the oral cavity and the vestibule. You can look here, you see the oral cavity is this region where we find the palate, the roof of the mouth, as well as the tongue and the lower portion of the mouth. The vestibule is this posterior region. Okay, and so we chew food with the teeth and tongue, form it into a ball called a bolus, and then using the tongue pass it posteriorly into the vestibule. Okay, now in the vestibule, we will then pass the food to the oropharynx, the pharynx, and the esophagus. So the cheeks, this is another one of those obvious things, form the lateral walls of the mouth, the side walls of the mouth. They have muscles that are used for facial expression as well as chewing. And it's lined by a moist mucous membrane composed of stratified squamous epithelium. Now, stratified here, again, is important. Of course, you remember from A&P1 that stratified refers to multiple cell layers, and we need to have multiple cell layers here in the epithelium because as our mucous membrane comes into contact with solid food, we're going to slough off the top layers of cells. The lips, also known as the labia, these are highly mobile structures. They surround the mouth and they're used for forming speech, as I'm doing now. They also tell us about the temperature and the texture of the food we're about to ingest. Now, the tongue is a thick muscular organ, and it occupies the floor of the mouth, and it fills the oral cavity when our mouth is closed. The lingual frenulum is that attachment below your tongue that attaches the tongue to the floor of the mouth. The papillae are these structures here. Most people would look at this and think the papillae are taste buds, but actually taste buds are located on the papillae. And I believe we've got a picture of that somewhere. We had a picture of it in the nervous system unit. That's where that was. So good, we've already covered that. All right. The lingual tonsils also you'll see back here in the posterior region of the tongue. They are lymphatic masses, malt, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. All right, now the palate is the roof of your mouth, and you have a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is seen here, composed mostly of the ethmoid and some of the palatine bones here. All right, and then you have the soft palate posterior to that. The soft palate has some cartilage and connective and epithelial tissue here, and it sort of forms a flap that moves between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Okay, and basically it closes off the oral cavity when we are just breathing normally through our nose. Okay, when we swallow, it moves up to block off the nasal cavity to ensure that the food doesn't move up into the nasal cavity. It makes sure that the food we swallow moves down into the esophagus. All right. The uvula, if you've ever seen a cartoon and they look inside someone's mouth on a cartoon, someone screams, you always see that dangly bit at the back of the throat. Here you can see that's the uvula at the back of the soft palate here. All right, so here are the teeth. We might have mentioned these, I believe, during the skeleton unit briefly. Teeth are not technically bone. They are composed of, if I remember correctly here, about 95% hydroxyapatite, maybe 90, whereas bone is composed of about 83% hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is a calcium salt. So teeth are about 90-95% hydroxyapatite, and bones about 83-ish percent hydroxyapatite. Teeth are also not technically bones because bone is a living tissue which is supplied with, well, teeth are also supplied with blood, but the bone itself is full of living cells that will maintain the bone. On the other hand, we develop our teeth and then we don't regrow our teeth. Okay, so that's the difference between teeth and bone. Anyway, back to this. You have 20 primary teeth. These primary teeth are also known as the deciduous teeth or the baby teeth. Now, you've heard of a deciduous tree, right? Those are the trees that lose their leaves every fall. Okay, and so the deciduous teeth are the teeth that we're going to lose as a child. The adult has 32 secondary teeth, also known as the permanent or adult teeth. All right. You can see over here a model. I think that's a model. It may be real. It doesn't. It looks kind of plastic. Anyway, you can see here the adult or secondary teeth above the deciduous teeth, and they're going to move down and push out of the way the deciduous teeth. The secondary teeth will move down and push out the primary teeth. All right. So if we look at the adult mouth here, okay, the adult has 3 molars in each quadrant. By the way, you can divide the mouth into quadrants, and so you can divide it into a left and right, upper and lower. All right, and so it makes it easier to count the teeth. We'll just go ahead and look down here. You've got 3 molars in each quadrant as an adult. The child only has 2. Okay, they only have 2 here. The adult has 2 premolars, also known as bicuspids, whereas the child has 0. Okay. And then both adult and child have 1 canine in this quadrant and then 2 incisors. All right, so this is just for this quadrant. The adult has 3 molars where the child has 2. The adult has 2 premolars or bicuspids where the child has none. And then both child and adult have a canine and 2 incisors per quadrant. Now, if you remember that and you want to know how many teeth there are total, multiply each of those by 4 because there are 4 quadrants, right? Here's one quadrant, here's a second quadrant, here's a third quadrant, and a fourth quadrant. Okay. See, is there anything more we want to say about this? Wisdom teeth. So wisdom teeth are actually the third molar back here, and they're some of the last teeth to come in. They're called wisdom teeth because they come in later in age, I guess, if they come in at all. Uh, for some people, many people, they come in just fine. They're not a problem. For others, they're going to come in at an angle. They may come in out of the ramus of the mandible. We go up to the mandible here. They may come in at an angle, coming in maybe sideways even out of the mandible. And if that's the case, they're going to push the second molar out of place, and that's going to be a problem. So that's why people need to have wisdom teeth removed only if the third molar is coming in at an angle. So here we see the tooth. The outer region is known as the enamel. That's the white portion. It starts out white anyway. White portion on the outside of the tooth. Okay, deep to that is the dentin. And then deep to that we find the pulp, which is where you have the blood vessels and the nerve fibers. Okay. Now, connecting the tooth to the mandible or to the maxilla, all right, either way, it's going to connect it to this little socket called an alveolar process, is the periodontal ligament. Okay. Periodontal ligament, if you remember from the joints lesson, joints lecture, that was a gomphosis type joint. All right. Caries are the medical term for cavities found within the enamel of a tooth. They happen when food sticks to the teeth or gets lodged between them, or stuck in the crevices in the molars. The bacteria that live there, they metabolize the sugars and then they release acids as a byproduct of that metabolism. And the acids break down the enamel and the dentin, forming holes in the tooth. You can prevent these dental caries, these cavities, with brushing and flossing. Flossing is especially important because many of us brush but don't floss, and then food gets left in the spaces between the teeth. And that's just a great place for bacteria to grow. You can get regular dental exams and cleanings. The dentist will attempt to clean some of the spots you missed. They can see it better than you. You can also take fluoride treatments or drink tap water. There's actually been a spike in the last 2 decades in the number of cavities people have, and that's been partially blamed on the fact that many of us are drinking bottled water, which is not necessarily fluorinated. Tap water, on the other hand, is fluorinated, and that fluoride protects our teeth. Plus, Louisville's got some of the best tasting tap water in the country, possibly the world. Just makes sense to drink tap water. All right. You can also get sealants, which is where the dentist applies an epoxy to the tooth, fills it in. It's also called a filling. All right, so we talked about these parts of the oral cavity. Moving on, you have salivary glands in the oral cavity, which secrete saliva. Let me go ahead and pull up MS Paint so I can draw something for you. Okay. So the salivary glands are arranged in a series of ducts and acini. Okay. It's a very crude drawing. I'm doing this from my desktop with a mouse. Okay. So just go ahead and understand that this duct is lined with epithelium. Okay, epithelial cells make up the lining of the duct and the acinus. Go ahead and all right, and where's the text? Okay. This is this region is known as an acinus. More than one is acini. Anyway, this duct in the acinus is lined with epithelial tissue, and you're going to find that the ductal cells, that is the cells that make up the duct, are going to produce. Oh man, that's not good. All right. How do I draw this? Let's do blue. Okay. They're going to produce the aqueous component. Aqueous component, which is mostly water and bicarbonate. Okay. And so yeah, the ductal cells will produce water and bicarbonate, or rather, they will secrete water and bicarbonate. The cells of the acinus are going to produce, let's do this in orange, just to contrast. They're going to produce enzymes, mostly amylase. Amylase is an enzyme which breaks down carbohydrates. Okay, go ahead and add that. Mainly complex carbohydrates, starts breaking them down into simple sugars. Okay, go ahead and leave that there for now. All right. So three major pairs of salivary glands. You've got the parotid glands, the submandibular glands, and the sublingual glands. The parotid glands are the largest of these glands, and they're found posteriorly along the ramus of the mandible, just medial to the ramus of the mandible. Infero-anterior to that position, you'll find the submandibular glands just below the mandible. And then anterior to that, maybe a little lower, you'll find the sublingual glands. Sublingual means below the tongue, so you'll find them below the tongue. All right, where are we? Okay. So the parotid glands, these are the largest. We mentioned that. They produce the salivary amylase. Again, that's the enzyme that breaks down complex carbohydrates. The submandibular glands have a mix of serous and mucus glands. The serous glands are going to produce Uh, Sorry, I just blanked. The serous glands are going to produce the, having a hard time remembering. I'm going to go ahead and look. The watery fluid with the amylase. That's it. The mucus glands produce just mucus, which keeps the mouth moist. There we go. The parotid glands are mostly serous, and so they will make the amylase. The submandibular glands have a mix of mucus glands and the serous glands that produce amylase and bicarbonate. And then the sublingual glands, they produce mostly mucus. Okay, and so here we have a view of that. Here's the parotid salivary gland, again found back here along the ramus of the mandible, just medial to it, producing mostly water with bicarbonate and enzymes. The submandibular gland down here has a mix, producing mucus and uh, alkali water containing enzymes. And then here below the tongue, you have the sublingual gland. There's the tongue, which produces that mucus. All right, here we see a cross section of these. Here you can see a pretty good outline of an acinus right here, and then the duct. Okay, and then over here on the right, you have a cross section of a duct. Okay. All right, so the pharynx is the cavity behind the mouth, posterior to the mouth, and it extends down to the esophagus. All right. The esophagus is a muscular tube that extends from the pharynx to the stomach. The first 1/3 of the esophagus is skeletal muscle, and the second 2/3, or the remaining 2/3, the inferior 2/3 of the esophagus is surrounded by smooth muscle. All right. So the pharynx and the esophagus do not aid in food digestion. They are literally just muscular structures that move food down toward the stomach. All right. So the pharynx, I believe we covered this. We might have mentioned this in the respiratory unit. Maybe we didn't. Has three portions. There's the nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx behind the, well, down here's the larynx, but just up here near the larynx, we have the laryngopharynx. And most of the time we're breathing. Okay, most of the time we're breathing, and we actually do most of our breathing through our nose. And so in this case, while we're just sitting here breathing, the soft palate will be lowered. Air can pass through the nasal cavity down into the trachea easily. The epiglottis will be, well, the epiglottis actually doesn't move. The epiglottis more or less stays in place, but it'll be up and out of the way. When we swallow, on the other hand, okay, we're going to chew the food up, roll it into a ball called a bolus here, and then with the tongue push it back into the vestibule. Now, once we push that food into the vestibule, we're going to initiate a reflex that will raise the soft palate and close off the nasal cavity so that food doesn't go up into the nose. Then the bolus will be pushed down and the trachea will lift up to meet the epiglottis, and we'll actually close off the larynx here when we do that. And now the bolus can pass posteriorly into the esophagus and then down to the stomach. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work. Frequently when we're drinking water, uh, you'll get a little bit that just enters the laryngopharynx or the larynx, triggering a coughing reflex. All right, so swallowing can be divided into three stages. You've got the first stage, which is voluntary, and that's where we mix the saliva with the chewed food and form that bolus or ball. Okay. The second stage begins when food reaches the oropharynx and it starts that swallowing reflex. We mentioned the soft palate and the uvula move up, close off the nose. The hyoid bone and the larynx move up so that they will meet the epiglottis and close off the larynx, which protects the trachea. Okay. Then we have longitudinal muscle in the pharynx, and when the longitudinal muscle, I guess you can't see my hands, but when it contracts, it's going to shorten the pharynx. And then you have inferior constrictor muscles in the pharynx that are going to relax. And the inferior constrictor muscles control the opening into the esophagus. So when we relax those, we're able to move food into the esophagus. Although the inferior constrictor muscles are not a particularly strong sphincter, and so they're not a major concern. Then we use a rhythmic contraction called peristalsis, which will move food down to the esophagus. Okay. Peristalsis is where we see contraction in one part of a muscular tube and then relaxation in a different part. And the wave of contraction moves the food forward. And we'll look at that in a second. The third stage of swallowing is where peristalsis moves the food in the esophagus down to the stomach. Let's see. Here you can see that reflex. So we've got the bolus, moved it back into the vestibule, and it triggers mechanoreceptors that are going to initiate the reflex. One more time. That soft palate raises up, the bolus moves into the oropharynx, and then from here, the larynx moves up and meets the epiglottis, closing off the larynx. Now, the food is able to pass down into the esophagus. Now, once the food's in the esophagus, this swallowing reflex is going to start the peristalsis that moves food down to the stomach. And so here you can see we've contracted the smooth muscle around this portion of the esophagus, and it's relaxed below that. We will then contract this portion, which you see in part 2 over here, which pushes the food forward. We then contract this portion of the smooth muscle, which again pushes the food forward until eventually it reaches the stomach. If you have a hard time remembering the fact that peristalsis moves food down to the stomach, this popped into my head one day. Like many students, I at one point thought that gravity moved food down to the stomach, but that's actually not the case, and we know that just as armchair scientists. We know that because astronauts don't starve to death in space, right? In a zero gravity or low gravity environment, um, they're still able to eat and swallow, and that's because it's peristalsis that moves the food down to the stomach, not gravity. All right. So we've talked about the esophagus. Um, good. Now, this. So one thing we've mentioned before is that the diaphragm is a muscular wall that separates the thorax from the abdomen. All right, it's this, you can see it here, this thin layer. It's a muscular wall that separates the two. There's a space, though, that allows the esophagus to move through, or to, well, travel through, and that's known as the esophageal hiatus. My niece, my daughter's child, actually was born with a condition called congenital diaphragmatic hernia, or CDH. And people with this condition have an abnormally large esophageal hiatus, which actually allows abdominal contents to move into the thorax. The stomach and intestines and liver and such can move into the thorax, which increases pressure on the thoracic organs,